Okay, thank you very much to Sarah and to the whole Bluestocking staff, because I know it's a lot of work putting on these events. I'm Anja Clark from Marxist-Humanist Initiative, and we are sponsoring tonight's event. So I'm just going to say a couple words about Marxist-Humanist Initiative, and then you'll hear tonight's presentations. What do I need? Really? You people, I don't know. All right, I'm still Anja Clark of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, and we're sponsoring this event. We're very glad to have Chris Gilligan visiting here from Scotland and be able to present his ideas about Brexit. What a mess. To you. Let me just say that Marxist-Humanist Initiative is celebrating our 10th anniversary. We just turned 10 years old. And I hope everyone got a copy of our little statement about who we are. You'll learn a lot more if you look at our website. And we recently published this little booklet, which I hope Bluestockings is going to sell for us. They have to check with how they do things. But it's called Resisting Trumpist Reaction and Left Accommodation, Marxist-Humanist Perspectives. And we're very proud of this. And today we just put up videos of us reading it on our website. So if you don't want a print copy, you can hear our new videos. I hope you'll look at our website in any event and access all kinds of information there. The Marxist-Humanist Initiative is not a political party. We're not trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and create society on its basis. So you can read the rest of the statement, and I say a whole lot more on our website. And we invite you to write for our online publication. We invite you to sign our mailing list, although Mike's got it back there. We don't have many public events, but we'd certainly like to let you know about things. Tomorrow we'll be at the Historical Materialism Conference, in case any of you are going to that. If you are, catch us at 1 o'clock at our panel, which is on resisting Trumpist reaction and left accommodation. And now let me introduce Chris. You probably saw a notice or a flyer. Chris Gilligan teaches at the University of the West of Scotland. He's a veteran migrant rights activist, a founder of Open Borders Scotland, and he's the author of Northern Ireland and the Crisis of Anti-Racism. This is his book, and Bluestockings is selling it right now, so you can get it before you leave. And we thank Chris very much for coming all this way. And now I'm going to turn it over to him to speak on Brexit and the future of Ireland and Scotland beyond the pro-anti-Brexit quagmire.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Bluestockings, for having me. My experience in New York is limited, and a lot of it's from the television, so I feel like I should be saying, "Hello, New York!" Isn't that what they do at the gigs? I'm here to talk about Brexit, and my experience of talking about Brexit in Scotland, in Ireland, I've been around speaking to various different audiences, is that people find Brexit very confusing. That's reassuring for me because I find Brexit very confusing, and I've been trying to work out how to make sense of Brexit So what I'm going to present today is where my thinking is at, and I think I'm not doing a bad job, but I'm really interested in your feedback. Don't see this as a finished piece of work, but I'm interested in what you have to say on what I'm going to speak about. What I'm going to do really is I'm going to talk about four things. I'm going to talk about, take the title of the talk, which is the Brexit Quagmire, and I'm going to talk about what kind of quagmire Brexit is. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Then I'm going to look at how did the UK come to be in this quagmire. The third thing I'm going to look at is why did the left get so involved in taking sides in the Brexit quagmire. And the fourth thing I'm going to look at is there a way out of this quagmire for the forces of freedom, for people who are struggling for human emancipation. So those are four things I'm going to do. So firstly, what kind of Brexit? Or what kind of quagmire is Brexit? And I think there's three ways in which I'd look at this. So it's a quagmire in the sense that it's a seemingly irresolvable dilemma. We have basically three options on the table. The UK can remain within the European Union. That's one option. That got rejected in a referendum where a majority of people, 52% to 48%, majority of 52% voted to leave the EU. So that's not going to happen. The UK is going to leave the EU because a majority voted for it in a referendum. Another option is that Britain leaves the EU, crashes out of the EU without any kind of deal, what's referred to as a hard Brexit. That option has been voted down in Parliament in Westminster. So that can't happen. The third option is that the UK remains in some kind of relationship with the EU. So Theresa May's deal is currently the option, the withdrawal agreement that maintains some kind of relationship with the EU. What the hard Brexiteers refer to as the UK remaining a vassal state, or the UK remaining a rule taker from the EU, because they will have to shadow trade policy and good standards and goods with the EU. That can't happen because that was voted down in Westminster by the biggest majority ever against the sitting government. So it's a dilemma, because there's three options, none of which can happen, but one of which must happen. So the way that that's been dealt with so far is the UK was supposed to leave on the 28th of March and it got deferred. The UK was supposed to leave the EU today and it got deferred. And now the UK is supposed to leave on the 31st of October, which is very fitting, it's Halloween. So the living dead Prime Minister zombie Theresa May is going to come knocking on the door of the EU and say, trick or treat. Give us the goodies or we're going to smash your windows. And the EU are going to go, that's not going to happen. Do you want another delay? So that's the situation we're in. So it's a seemingly irresolvable dilemma that we've got. There's another sense in which we have a Brexit quagmire. Brexit is like a swamp or quicksand. I used to have nightmares about this when I was about 10 or 12, because there were lots of programs on the television where people seemed to just get caught in quicksand. Like Tarzan in the 1970s seemed to get caught in, people got caught in quicksand a lot in Tarzan. In lots of the westerns I looked at, watched, the bad guys got caught and sometimes the good guys got caught in quicksand. And I had this fear, as a nightmare when I was a child, because when you get caught in quicksand, the more you struggle, the faster you go down. So you try not to struggle, and you do something like try and get your belt off of making as little movement as possible and do something clever to get out of it. or you wait for someone to come along and hand you a stick and help you out. So Brexit's like that. It's like a quagmire, like a swamp, because there's a number of different contradictions that are at the heart of Brexit. They're very real contradictions. I'm going to just briefly mention 4. There's this, what I call a citizenship contradiction. There's 2 different conceptions of citizenship that are at play in Brexit. There's an ethnic conception of citizenship, and that's what the Leave vote represents. It was a vote where a significant number voted because they wanted to restrict immigration. It was an ethnic vote, an ethno-national vote, because EU citizens resident in the UK were not allowed to vote in the EU referendum. So we have that. That was an ethnic vote, or an ethnic conception of citizenship. But there's also a republican or civic conception of citizenship, that people who participate in politics and political life are part of the body politic, and they're part of represent the will of the people, and so democratically they should be listened to. The 3 million EU citizens that are living in the UK have been active in protesting against Leave and arguing, many of them arguing for Remain. So you have these 2 different conceptions of citizenship that are arguing 2 different sides. And that's irresolvable because they're 2 different conceptions. How do you decide which one's correct? Like, there's no logical way to do it. It's a matter of making a moral or a political judgment. The other contradiction I want to mention is the United Kingdom contradiction. The United Kingdom is a united kingdom of 4 different parts: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I think a lot of Americans find this difficult to understand, so if you think of it like this, and it's always a problem with analogies, so don't want to go too far with the analogy, but if you think of it like this, imagine America was California, a large, prosperous, heavily populated state. That's England. A smaller state, Nevada, that's Wales. A place that is cold and produces oil, that's Alaska. And somewhere that's not quite American but is American, Hawaii, that's Northern Ireland. And we've got this situation where the majority, largely because of England, but a slight majority in Wales, voted to leave the EU. But a majority in Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain within the EU. So you have a contradiction there, because the vote to leave is to take sovereignty back from Europe and to have it in the United Kingdom. But 2 parts of the United Kingdom are saying, we don't want to do that. And there's a very real possibility that the United Kingdom will break up if there is a Brexit, because Scotland may decide, no, we'd rather be part of the EU and leave the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland may decide, no, we'd rather be part of a united Ireland and want to leave the UK. So constitutionally, there's that very real contradiction there. And it's, if one side wins, the other side possibly lose at the same time, right? By having sovereignty, then they lose or face the possible breakup of the United Kingdom. A third contradiction is the border control contradiction. One of the prime slogans of the Leave campaign is "Take back control of our borders." And that was conceived primarily in terms of immigration during the campaign. Take back control of our borders. As soon as the vote happened, and it was clear that Leave was happening, people suddenly realised, oh, taking back control of our borders means the border in the island of Ireland. because that's the only land border there will be, in the case of leave, between the EU and the UK. And the Good Friday Agreement guarantees that that border stays open. If the UK leaves, then there needs to be a border and border controls. And so that's what one of the dilemmas is. The backstop, which is what's been talked about, is the guarantee written into the withdrawal agreement that's created lots of problems for some Conservative MPs and for the Democratic Unionist Party. The backstop says until the UK can come up, or the UK and EU can come up with some mutual agreement about how to have a frictionless border on the island of Ireland, then Northern Ireland will remain part of the European trade area. So take back control of the borders means losing control of the borders, right? So this is another dilemma within or contradiction within Brexit. And the fourth contradiction is what I call the democratic contradiction. The referendum is what some people are referring to as direct democracy. It wasn't politicians that took the decision. It was the people who directly took the decision by a majority voting and saying, we are giving you an instruction, leave the EU. Right? So they're given a direct instruction from the people. So the democratic will, in terms of direct democracy, says, leave the EU. And that's in conflict with representative democracy, the way in which the will of the people is mediated through elected representatives and political parties in Parliament. The majority of MPs voted Remain and are thought to be keen not to have a hard Brexit and keen to maintain some kind of relationship with the EU. So you have a conflict between direct democracy and participative democracy. The thing about that is that the direct democracy is a limited form of direct democracy, because it was only at the moment of the vote that people said, this is what we want. After the vote, some people who didn't vote went, oh, well, if I'd realised that a goal would go that way, I might have voted. So MPs, as constituency MPs who represent all of their constituents, not just the people who voted for them, are representing their interests, those of their constituents in Parliament, by saying, this isn't what my constituents want, necessarily. So there is a very real conflict there. There's also a real conflict there because the question on the ballot paper said, do you want to remain in the EU or leave the EU? It didn't specify what leaving the EU meant. So you've now got a situation where that genius, political genius of Theresa May says, well, it's very clear, Brexit means Brexit. But what does Brexit mean? It's really unclear. So you get the hardline, no-deal Brexiteers who are saying, well, really, no-deal Brexit's Brexit. The logic is, if we're going to leave the EU, then that means a complete break from the EU. Except we don't know that that's what the logic was that people were using when they voted in the referendum. And various things, like if you look at the size of the protests in favour of Remain, or the protests in favour of a people's vote, compared to the protests in favour of hard Brexit, the hard Brexit protests are much smaller. If you look at, there's a petition, an e-petition to Parliament that's saying revoke Article 50, remain in the EU. And 6 million people have signed that petition. It was only 17 million people who voted to leave. Right? So that gives you an indication of the scale. There's also a petition, e-petition in Parliament, to revoke for hard Brexit. and that's got 600,000 people who've signed it, so 10% of the numbers that have signed the petition. So in a sense, what the parliamentarians are trying to do is square the circle. How do they resolve this contradiction? And that's one of the reasons why it's going round and round and round in circles and getting deferred, because there are real paradoxes there that are difficult to resolve. Then the third sense in which this is a quagmire is it's a hazardous situation. It's politically dangerous. It creates a politically dangerous situation. There's lots of uncertainty. It's politically dangerous because we have workers divided on both sides. Working class that voted for Remain and a working class that voted for Leave that are being put at loggerheads in the Brexit dispute. It's dangerous because this has created opportunities for the far right. Nigel Farage has left UKIP and he's formed his own party, and the UKIP that's left behind has become a much more explicitly far right party. They've become aligned with Tommy Robinson, who some of you may have heard of here, but he's a far right figure in the UK. The delay in Brexit to October means that there will be European elections coming up for the European Parliament. Those elections are being seen by many people as this will be a proxy for the referendum, a second referendum. Historically, UKIP did really well in those elections. Historically, there's low turnout to European elections, like local government elections. It's unlikely to be what's going to happen this time. There's likely to be a higher turnout, but it's unclear what's going to happen. And it's certainly quite possible that the far right may gain some seats in the European Parliament as a consequence of this. It's a possibility it may not happen. One of the things I think is much more insidious is this narrative that's been promoted by not just the far right, but some on the right of the Conservative Party as well, of a narrative of betrayal, a betrayal of the people. This is the kind of narrative you had amongst the Nazis in the 1930s about we got stabbed in the back in the First World War by the left who ended the war when we could have won it. We got stabbed in the back by the Versailles Treaty. This is betrayal, and we're getting that narrative that's getting traction in the UK today. So in that sense, Brexit as a quagmire, as a dangerous political situation, is a situation we're in today. So there's those three different elements of Brexit as a quagmire. A seemingly irresolvable dilemma, a contradiction, a swamp, and a hazardous situation. There's those. So, what kind of quagmire is Brexit? It's those three different kinds of quagmires. Brexit. After all that, you might think, how did the left come to be involved in the middle of this so enthusiastically, taking sides, Leave or Remain? In terms of their own rationale, the pro-EU left say the EU has protected workers' rights. There's a section of the left that see the EU as being a restraint on the Conservative Party in terms of undermining workers' rights, and so they see the EU as something that protects workers' rights. On the Leave side, there's those who say the EU is a neoliberal institution. Leaving the EU will undermine the EU as a neoliberal institution and will undermine neoliberalism. So there are those arguments that are being given by the left. I could go into more, but just for time, not go into more. So that's what they're saying. One of the things that I think is interesting is that shows that left approach shows something about the way, the underlying thinking of the left that have got involved in taking sides. The left who've taken sides are what I call sovereigntists, or they're people who see the state as being the way through which you look after the interests of the working class. We need the EU state to protect workers' rights. The state will do it. You get organisations like DM25, the Democracy in Europe movement, Yanis Varoufakis, who was the Greek minister leading the DM25, who says we can reform the EU and make it work more in the interests of workers. On the Leave side, there are those who say we should be out of the EU. In the UK, we have parliamentary sovereignty. We don't have all of these checks and balances on government that you have in the US and other places that have written constitutions. Once the left's in power, then we are able to bring in whatever programme we want. A Corbyn government can renationalise. A Corbyn government can make all of these changes. That's part of the underlying thinking on the sections of the left. I think that that kind of thinking is those sections of the left who think like a ruling class. They think it would be better if we were the ones that were in power running capitalism, because we would run it better in the interests of workers. It's thinking like a ruling class. There's another aspect of the left in relation to this, and that's the left that see themselves as the leaders of the working class. There are some on the left who retrospectively say, we know this is a working class victory, Leave, because a significant number of working class people voted to leave in those areas of the UK that were decimated by deindustrialization. So the analogy in the US context would be the argument about the left behinds who voted for Trump in the election. And that notion that it's the leadership of the left that's going to change things. I think that's a retrospective argument of justification, because the left didn't know that Leave was going to win. They didn't know that the working class was going to back Leave. They had that position to start off with, and they were promoting that position. When Leave happens, they promote that position very strongly, that it's the working class, because they don't want to say, look, we're also associated with this right of the Conservative Party, we're also associated with these UKIPers, we're also associated with those who are talking about immigration controls and saying the problem of migrants is why you should vote for Leave. So they're being dishonest in the way that they're presenting what's going on, and it was a preconceived notion that they had going into the referendum. So that's how the left got involved in this mess. I think essentially because they think like a ruling class, and any issue of the day they think we have to have a position on this, what will our position be, and then we have to get in. And they've ended up on different sides. So some of the left are on the Remain side, some of the left are on the Leave side. So how do we get out of this mess? One of the things that I found useful in trying to think about this, about how we get out of this mess, is actually to go back to the 1940s. And I was really struck by this paragraph when I was reading State Capitalism and World Revolution. It's written by State Capitalist Tendency, or the Forrest Johnson tendency. For those of you who aren't left train spotters, I'll just explain a bit of who the Forrest Johnson tendency were. The Forrest Johnson tendency were a stream or strand within the American Trotskyist movement. C.L.R. James, you might know, the Trinidadian Marxist who went to Britain, became a Trotskyist in Britain, came over to America, went and met Trotsky. A lot of the Trotsky's writing on the black question was influenced by his discussions with C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James is J.R. Johnson of the Johnson-Forrest tendency, and Freddie Forrest was Raya Dunevskaya, born in the Ukraine and came over to the US in 1918 and landed in Chicago. And they were joined by Grace Lee Boggs and to form the Forrest Johnson tendency. And the Forrest Johnson tendency are really remarkable because you have the left is dominated in the 1930s and 1940s by the reformist left, the Second International, and the Stalinist left, the Third International, and the Trotskyist movement's a tiny movement within the left. And the Forrest Johnson tendency critique Trotsky and Stalin and the reformist left. You can imagine they were very popular at the time. And what their criticism was of initially the critique was, and a whole section of the Trotskyist movement broke on this critique, was whenever the Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed, they said Trotsky must be wrong. This section said Trotsky must be wrong because there's no way they could still characterize the Soviet Union as a worker state, even a degenerated worker state, if it's signing up with fascism. And so there's a critique developed. Right. There's a critique developed by them of Trotskyism as well as Stalinism, and this really jumped out at me when I was reading through State Capitalism and World Revolution, where they say the first sentence of the transitional program, that's Trotsky's transitional program, the first sentence of the transitional program states that the crisis of the revolution is the crisis of revolutionary leadership. This is the reiterated theme throughout the program. Exactly the opposite is the case. It is the crisis of the self-mobilization of the proletariat. To say that all the proletariat needs is revolutionary leadership drowns all differences between us, i.e. the Stalinists and the differences between the Stalinists and the Trotskyists, and strengthens their, i.e. the Stalinist, conception of the party. I think that it's the crisis of the revolution is a crisis not of revolutionary leadership, but of the self-mobilization of the proletariat, is truer today than it was when they were writing. There are a lot of people making analogies between today and the 1930s. The spectre of fascism growing again. That quote by Gramsci about the old is dying and the new is yet to be born is one that's been used a lot. And it does chime with the times. It does. There are definitely things that are going on. I think there's one fundamental difference. Although there was a crisis of the self-organization of the working class in the 1930s, there was an organized working class, a significant organized working class. That's why the brown shirts had to come out in force and smash them in large numbers. That's why you had to have Mussolini. That's why you had to have Hitler. That's why you had to have Franco using physical force, because there was a real organized force that they were dealing with. That organized force may have had crap politics, reformism, Stalinism, but they were an organized force. And that's not the situation we're in today. we're in a situation where we still have a crisis of the self-organisation of working class, but a different kind of crisis. I mentioned that Brexit has several contradictions at its heart. The way that Marx and Hegel talk about contradictions is the way to overcome contradictions is not to go to one pole of the contradiction. Leave, remain, representative democracy, direct democracy. The way to overcome a contradiction is to transcend the contradiction. So, how do we transcend the contradiction? I think one thing is that representation needs to be self-representation. Not others representing us, not alienating our powers to someone else to do it for us, but self-representation. We're starting from a very low base, but that's the way in which there's a way forward for human emancipation. And that combined with direct participation that's not just a one-off vote, but direct participation in the running and organising of society is the way to overcome that contradiction between direct democracy and representative democracy. So that's one of the things I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts and ideas on. We may have seen glimpses of that in the past. In Marx's time, it was the Paris Commune. In Lenin's time, it's the Soviets in February 1917. The Soviets that are crushed under the weight of the party after 1917 and during the Civil War. But that's something that we need to reinvent for our times, and it will take a different form for our times. So that's something that needs to happen. The left today still think in terms of a crisis of leadership. That's why they're so enthusiastically involved on one side or other of the Brexit debate. You know, if only we had Corbyn in power, different leadership, things would be different. If only we had Bernie in power, different leadership, things would be different. If only we had our party in power, things would be different. It's still thinking as a crisis of leadership, not as a crisis of the self-organisation of the oppressed and the exploited. So, looking at a way to transcend the contradictions, I think, means looking at not the left, but who are the forces that are struggling for human emancipation. In the context of Brexit, we have two identifiable forces that are struggling for emancipation. The 3 million EU citizens that are organising and saying, we're resisting leave, or if leave is going to happen, we want to ensure that our rights are maintained, that there isn't an erosion of our rights in any independent, sovereign United Kingdom. Another internal critique of Brexit that's happening on the ground is on the Irish border. There are people who are protesting on the border in Ireland and saying, we want to keep this border open. So there are forces on the ground that are saying, we want our freedoms. We want to ensure our rights. We're demanding that our rights are not denied or rolled back by Brexit. And there are other forces that are at work going beyond the quagmire. There are those who haven't got involved in taking sides on Brexit, leave or remain. There are many pro-migrant activists who haven't taken sides, leave or remain. They say, what are we supposed to choose between? Deaths in the Mediterranean or the hostile environment in the UK? There is no choice there. We're not taking sides in this. You may have heard of the Stansted 15, who stopped the deportation in London a few months ago and were up in court. We're looking at life imprisonment for stopping deportation flight. They're still battling, but they're not going to go to prison for life, which is something good. A number of those people involved in that campaigning are in an organisation called Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. You may have seen that really cute movie about the miners' strike, Pride, Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners. It's following in that tradition. It's people who are saying, we know what it's like to be oppressed, and there are other people who we see who are being oppressed. We have something in common with them. This is not identity politics. This is saying we recognize our common humanity and common experience of oppression, and we will unite and act in solidarity with people who are facing that. Those are forces of revolution that are overcoming the quagmire. And then the other thing is worker struggles that are happening in the precarious part of the working class. So we've seen in London and in Brighton successful action by Deliveroo workers taking strike action, demanding better pay and working conditions and pension rights, and winning. We've seen cleaners in the University of London striking for better pay and conditions and winning. And a really significant thing about those precarious workers is a really high proportion of them are migrant workers. So there's a way in which those migrant workers can be an example to those people in the areas of industrial decline in the northeast of England and in the south of Wales, saying, don't stand with your bosses, don't stand with your government against migrants. You stand with migrants because we're fighting for the same freedoms and rights as you are. And that's a way of overcoming the contradictions and the quagmire that is Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And now, as advertised, we're going to have a very short 10-minute talk by Adam Plante, who's right here, who's a young Marxist-Humanist with a background in philosophy, history, and education. And I think he'll tell you a little more about himself. And after Adam speaks, then we'll have open discussion by everybody.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to speak really briefly about myself, and then I'm going to try to keep it under 10 minutes so we can get some discussion going. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for speaking, Chris. And I really want to thank Bluestockings for having us. Please let me know if you can't hear me, but I don't think that should be a problem. So I was drawn to Marxist-Humanism basically because of the rise of Trump and the failure of the left to adequately respond to that threat, which I'm going to speak about briefly here. And I imagine that growing up during the recession also may have influenced some of my views. So we stand at a moment of really extreme urgency. That's not just my opinion, that's a fact. Now is the time for principled action from the left. The rise of the far right, the rise of far right politics, the rise of far right terror, Trump's assault on the admittedly flawed rights and protections of liberal democracy, and perhaps most alarmingly, the accommodation and enabling of all of this by the so-called left. These threats demand that all of us respond to Trumpism with principled anti-racist, anti-sexist, liberatory, international, anti-capitalist action. It does not demand that we fight populism with populism. Unfortunately, the left has mostly failed to do this as of yet. Far from it, in fact. I hold in my hand one of the more remarkable documents that's come out of, or rather escaped from, the left's quagmire, Resisting Trumpist Reaction and Left Accommodation. I'm just going to call it the Perspectives for short. So how does Marxist-Humanism stand out on the left? The Perspectives, I think, speaks for itself on this issue, and I quote at length here. A great many factors have combined to hand Trump the presidency. a relatively small one, but one that may have been decisive in the 2016 election and may be decisive in the future, was the accommodation to Trumpism among parts of the so-called left. Destructive politics arose from a single-minded, narrow, anti-neoliberal leftism, which insisted that neoliberalism is a greater threat to humanity than proto-fascism. In an interview with WGBH during the 2016 election, Jill Stein went so far as to declare that, quote, "The answer to neo-fascism is stopping neoliberalism. Putting another Clinton in the White House will fan the flames of this right-wing extremism." As one commentator shrewdly noted, her plan was to stop Trump by electing him president. Another attitude that contributed to the soft-on-Trump leftism was the after-Trump our-term view. Actress and left activist Susan Sarandon, a Sanders supporter who later endorsed Stein, expressed this attitude as follows, quote, "Some people feel that Donald Trump will bring the revolution immediately. If he gets in, then things will really explode." And then there were other destructive attitudes that fueled softness towards Trump within the left. There were the Putinites and the barely distinguishable anti-imperialists who preferred Trump in order to enhance Putin's power and thereby weaken the power of the US. There were those who wanted nothing more than to punish the Democratic Party, irrespective of the consequences for the people of the US and the rest of the world. They wanted to punish the Democratic Party after their effort to take over the party failed. Finally, there were some nihilists who just wanted to burn it all down. What all these currents have in common is that they either downplayed the enormity of the threat that Trumpism poses or did not care enough about that threat. They therefore did not feel the need to act in a principled and effective way in a bourgeois election. Instead, they engaged in play-acting at revolution, casting pointless and self-indulgent votes at the ballot box that benefited the forces of reaction." End quote. This shallow, anti-imperialistic, merely anti-neoliberal left has neglected to ground itself in full-on anti-capitalism and anti-racism, despite the fact that, and when I say quote, I'm just going to quote from the perspectives, quote, "Racism and sexism have done more to divide the US working class than anything else." Confronting racism is absolutely a priority. Colorblind economic populism does little to challenge the divisions within the working class. Quote, "Convinced that building a left populist political movement is more important than defeating fascism, many left populists now play a dangerous game. Some even seek common cause with Trump to the extent that he represents an attack on the neoliberal order. Some go much further, like Chris Gilligan from Platypus, who said that, quote, "Anti-Trumpism is the problem and obstacle, not Trump." We've seen similar lines of thinking in other countries from so-called intellectuals, such as in, and again, quote, "In the last presidential election in France, where strikingly large sections of the left refused to vote for the centrist Macron, preferring to go down with the ship. Left intellectual Slavoj Žižek even advised French voters to abstain from voting in that country's second-round presidential election, arguing that, quote, "There is no real choice between Macron and Le Pen, i.e., between a neoliberal centrist and a neo-fascist." What a guy. This thinking comes from those who view neoliberalism rather than capitalism as the primary enemy, and who therefore prioritize fighting against neoliberalism over developing real anti-capitalist ideas. To be sure, these types do not usually endorse explicit appeals to white nationalist sentiments. Their words carefully condemn racism, xenophobia, misogyny, etc. The problem is rather that they seek to win over the authoritarian white nationalist base by offering one or another positive program that does not fight the base's authoritarianism, racism, sexism, and xenophobia head-on. So in other words, the issue is that, quote, "Some on the left believe that economic populism is the only way to fight Trumpism." This requires that they downplay the threat of reactionary forces such as racism and misogyny. The narrowly anti-neoliberal left, quote, "offers an alternative version of populism that it hopes authoritarian white nationalists that hopes will appeal to the authoritarian white nationalist base that supports Trump, Le Pen, and other people like that." Accordingly, this wing of the left treats Trumpism not as a threat and as an abomination that must be eliminated, but as a legitimate rival for the allegiance of the so-called white working class. Again, quote, "This creates a conflict when economic appeals to so-called white working class Trump voters require left populists to downplay or ignore anti-racist, anti-sexist, and pro-immigrant politics." There's a big problem with that, though, and I really wish I had more time to get into this. But that's just not true. It's a myth. Andrew Kleinman has done a good deal of research dispelling the myth that Trumpism is somehow a response to neoliberalism or economic distress, and instead argues that it's a pre-existing condition. Quote, the Trumpite base is not new. It is not a reaction to neoliberalism, globalization, financialization, etc. You can find his research in part 5 of our perspectives, as well as more detailed, actually much more detailed research in our online publication with Sober Senses, including the articles, Which Obama Voters Flipped to Trump, Which Did Not, and Why, and Obama-Trump Voters Rebelling Against Neoliberalism or Embracing Racism, Misogyny, and Authoritarianism. Okay, enough critiquing the left for now. What does, well, maybe not.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah. What does Marxist-Humanism have to offer instead? The core of Marxist-Humanism, in my view, is its unique perspective on the role of theory and its relation to practice. I'm not going to quote a major figure in American Marxist-Humanism that Chris mentioned, Raya Dunayevskaya, in her book Marxism and Freedom. Taking after Marx himself, Marxist-Humanism, quote, breaks with the whole concept of theory as something merely intellectual, or as a dispute between theoreticians. The concept of theory is now something unified with action. Or more correctly, theory is not something that the intellectual works out alone. There's a feedback loop of sorts between practice and theory, and theorizing is not a one-sided endeavor. In contrast to the vanguardist theoreticians, whose elitism deludes them into believing that their lofty theories will mold the masses and lead them to victory, Marxist-humanists believe that, quote, if, as a theoretician, one's ears are attuned to the new impulses from the workers, new categories of thought will be created, a new way of thinking, a step forward in philosophic cognition. Theory is not kept above the earth, but rather takes its departure from reality, which is also its point of return. This is a radically new view of theory. Theory is no longer about mere concepts. Marx breaks with the ordinary view of theory, seeing it as a motive, vital force within the movements of the masses. They're not some sort of, unthinking mob that just practices and then theoreticians have to come in later and guide them or show them the way. That's not true at all. Abstract, lofty systems do not lead the way. Real people do. And they already are. The practice of theory is, quote, an altogether different thing from applying an abstract, ready-made system of logic to the world and to the activity of actual living people. Unfortunately, I really don't have the time to completely flesh this out in more detail, but don't take my word for it. You can read our attempts to put this theory into practice by developing and concretizing ideas in our pamphlets, in our writings, and on our website. Especially such issues as the resistance to Trumpism, gun violence demonstrations, opposition to Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court, and women's protests. Thanks everyone for coming, and I look forward to the discussion period.
All right, I'm going to chair the discussion. Please keep your remarks to 3 minutes if possible. You doesn't have to be in the form of a question. You can tell us your own thoughts about these things we've brought up, okay? But please be respectful of the need to be brief so that we can finish at 9 and the Bluestockings people can close up. And again, if you want to buy Chris's book, Stamp Out Racism, it says on the wall, Northern Ireland and the Crisis of Anti-Racism, Rethinking Racism and Sectarianism. You should buy it from Bluestockings tonight, and you should take a look at Marxist-Humanist Initiative's website. You can get all kinds of information there. And now, who would like the floor? Yes, who are you?
Hi, I'm Renee. Yes, I have a question for Chris. In your opinion, who profits from Brexit in the political economic elite that was promoting and voting for Brexit?
Let's take, is it all right if we take like 2 or 3 questions at a time and then you answer
Yeah,
one?
can I just get you to repeat the question because I didn't
Yeah,
quite hear what you said?
Oh.
In your opinion, who do you think profits from Brexit? Like, the ones that, like the political and economic elite that were promoting and voting for Brexit and basically still walking around saying hard Brexit is a good thing while already like putting their companies abroad and in other EU member states. So who, if Brexit continues, if it may be a hard Brexit, who from those promoting that, from the political economic elites, would profit? Like, what are the logics, their interests behind promoting Brexit?
When you say profits, do you mean like profit in the sense of making money out of it, or be broader than just?
I think it all goes back to money. No?
Okay.
Yes, I like getting done with something going back to first stuff. So, what's the EU?
The European Union.
Oh, nice.
The European Union.
I couldn't eat with the CEO. He's very smart, you know. It seems like he's involved with all of it from the UK, but I couldn't figure out EU, you know.
Yeah,
And,
that's what it's all about.
You know, he went from Trump to the UK, and that's like the president don't even do that these days, and that's I give you props to that. But I know I couldn't. The initial EU, I didn't know. Sorry, but thank you.
Okay, sorry if you got lost. All right, let's take another question or comment, and then we'll let Chris.
Do you have an example?
Yes, what's your name, please?
Jake.
Jake.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of the sort of transcendental groups that you propose to sort of get out of the whole Brexit quagmire?
Here.
Oh.
Sorry.
Oh, hopefully they took down the question, because he's just taking down the questions and they're going to go through it again. But the question was basically, are there any?
If you stand, I think, and project better.
All right.
Is that right, Joe?
Are there any examples today of these political groups that Chris proposed could sort of transcend the quagmire that's Brexit today, where essentially we're addressing the needs of the people who are actually like being most negatively affected by the Brexit? So yeah, that was the question.
You want to handle those two? Oh, wait, we got another one. Okay. Oh, yes. What's your name, please?
Megan.
Megan, okay. You want to stand up and project?
You don't have to feel compelled.
I'm curious about the border of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Like, who are those protesters? Are they coming from the north? Are they coming from Ireland? I'm very curious about that, keeping the border open.
All right.
I just have a brief kind of informational question. How many people, or are there statistics of how many people did not vote in the referendum that could have voted and abstained?
Right. I'll deal with the easy one first. 78% was the turnout.
7-0?
78
78.
was the turnout,
Oh my God.
which is high for a turnout. So there's definitely something going on there in terms of enthusing people to go out and vote and leave. So subtract that from 100, and it's my maths quick enough. So it's 22%, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, I'll take the next easiest one for me. It's the Irish border. The Irish, the people who are protesting are people who live on the Irish border. I used to live in Northern Ireland, near the border with the Republic, in Derry or London Derry. In Northern Ireland, we have two names for something sometimes because Catholics call it one thing and Protestants call it something else. I lived there, and whenever we wanted to get petrol, we drove across the border into the Republic of Ireland because tax on petrol is cheaper or lower, so you fill up your car. So you'd notice where the border was on any main road, because you go through these country roads with nothing, and then 4 petrol stations appear right alongside each other. So that's you know, there's a lot of movement across the border like that. My parents lived in Fermanagh, which is in Northern Ireland, and when I would go on home and see them at Christmas, and they ask me to go out to the shops and get some bread and milk. I go to the supermarket to get some bread and milk, and couldn't get any parking in these huge parking lots for supermarkets, because lots of people from the Republic of Ireland had come up to do their Christmas shopping, because a whole lot of things are cheaper in Northern Ireland than they are in the South. So there's that movement backwards and forwards for commercial reasons of ordinary people. But then there's also the farmers that live on the border, and the border is a really jagged border. It's not a straight line. It's not, Northern Ireland wasn't divided up like Africa was. It's jagged line using geographical landmarks, hills and rivers and things. And so you've got a situation where there are some milk processing plants in the Republic of Ireland, and the lorries set out to get milk to do the milk processing, and they drive across the border into Northern Ireland and pick up some milk from a farmer, and then they drive about 5 miles and they pick up from a farmer in the Republic of Ireland, and then they drive another 5 miles and pick up from a farmer in Northern Ireland, and then in the Republic, and then come back to the plant to unload the milk. With Brexit, that's import-export 5 times in one journey. Right? So a lot of the farmers are really concerned about this. There's farmers who have divided their cattle stock, so they have Northern Irish cattle and Southern Irish cattle, because they can't, every time they take them to another field to graze, if it's across the border, then they're importing livestock across the border. And the EU has very strict regulations on the import of livestock and agricultural produce. So those are some of the people that are protesting. And then other people that are protesting are people who remember that that border was a militarized border that had military outposts, where you had surveillance of everyone in all of those country lanes. You had lots of those roads weren't open during the Troubles, because the military blew up bridges, or they put great big steel and concrete barriers across the road to reduce the number of passable roads. And those all got opened up with the peace process. So there's both a symbolic significance of it, but there's also a concern that if you have some kind of controls, border controls on the border, like a border post, or even just a surveillance camera that's going to check car registration numbers as they're going across the border, that is going to become a target for dissident Republicans. So people who were sympathetic or supporters or were active in the IRA who didn't agree with the peace agreement, and who don't support the peace process. For them, Brexit's like, it's Christmas. The Brits have just voted for a United Ireland, whippy. And any infrastructure they're likely to bomb. So if they bomb that infrastructure, then you need someone to guard and protect it. That's an even bigger, juicier target for them. So there's people who just see a slow unraveling of the peace is very possible in Northern Ireland if a border is erected. So those are the people who are on the border who are saying, right, this is something that we should be protesting against. What's not happening with those people is they're not linking up with the migrant groups in Northern Ireland and in the Republic who are saying the border is a different kind of issue for us. Because there already is a border in Ireland if you're a migrant, if you're a non-EU migrant. So there's free movement within the EU for EU citizens, but there's not free movement for people who are not EU citizens. So at present you do have border controls, but they don't happen like they do at the Mexico-US border. They happen, and there's a class dimension to this as well, they don't happen on the train usually, because train tickets are more expensive. They happen on the buses. They don't happen with cars generally, because people who can afford a car better. They happen on the buses, and the immigration authorities get it on the bus 20, 30 miles from the border. They get it on the Republic of Ireland, and they go up the bus, and they they're getting more subtle about how they do it. But initially you just went up with anyone of colour, right, show us your ID. Now they're just asking everyone. But in my experience, if you say to them, I don't have any ID, they just walk on. But if you're a person of colour and you say, I don't have any ID, then that's a reason to take you off the bus and question you further. And there's also a sea border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because the same thing is happening with the ferries that cross the Irish Sea, and planes that come, internal flights within the UK, coming from London to Belfast, or you're getting racial profiling of immigrants. Well, not actually, a lot of them aren't immigrants. They're UK citizens, but they're people of colour. So there already is a border, but those two groups aren't coming together and saying we have a common interest here in resisting the border. I would be really excited if that starts to happen, because that would be a really significant thing. In the way that lesbians and gays support the migrants is a significant thing in saying that we have common cause with people who you might not think necessarily you would automatically identify with. So, in part, that's relating to your question, Jake, about who are the groups that will transcend. I don't see Brexit's going to be transcended. This is a long game. It's more the question is, I think the idea of the party will lead hasn't worked. That's what the history of the 20th century tells us. And so that's why that notion of the self-organisation of the working class, the self-organisation of the masses, really struck me when I read that. That's a scary prospect in one way, because we're starting from a very low base in terms of trying to rebuild liberation. But I think the other side of it is that a lot of people who are in that position don't have an awful lot of respect, or are suspicious of the left, suspicious of those organisations that are saying we will represent you. So I think there is a basis for doing that, and it's happening. There are people who are organising on that basis. I was really struck in the US. I think it might actually be an example that's given in the Marxist-Humanist Perspectives document. The example of the Dreamers who interrupted Nancy Pelosi and said, when Nancy Pelosi's trying to do a deal over getting some of the Dreamers into to be allowed citizenship, and they said, all of us or none of us. You don't represent us. Self-representation. All of us or none of us. We're not going to take a deal that allows me to get in and doesn't allow my cousin or my friend or someone from another Latin American country. We represent ourselves. Those things I think are really positive currents that show there are those things that are there. And they didn't have to be told by the left, this is what you say or this is what you do. That's coming from within. So that potential is there, that is being developed and can be developed. And I think, you might think this is really peculiar living in the States and under Trump. It is scary. But looking at it and seeing the resistance, I don't see, a lot of people in the UK don't see an awful lot of what is happening with the resistance, because I'm following the MHI website. I see a lot more than the average person in the UK. And there's a lot of things happening. There is an awful lot of things happening, and it is really, to me, exciting, because it says there is a potential. There are things that are spontaneously happening. And I know that things can spontaneously happen and change. When I look at the Republic of Ireland is a really exciting place. There are things that have happened spontaneously out of the blue, protests against water charges that laid the basis for a lot of community organisation that then was the infrastructure that the Repeal the 8th campaign, the abortion rights campaign in Ireland built on. So there are those things that are happening, and that was outside of political parties, outside of the structure of political parties. So it can be done, and I think learning the lesson that the left in lots of ways suppresses those movements by saying what you need to do is follow us because we know the way to do it. we are the experts, we will give you the leadership. We should learn a lesson that hasn't worked. It's not, we shouldn't think of it as a problem of a crisis of leadership. We should think of it as a problem of a crisis of the self-organization of the masses. So I hope that answers. It's not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next year, or 10 years from now, but I think logically that's the way it has to happen.
So it seems like if I were to say the answer to the question would be community organizers probably play the best role in actually being able to create those organizations.
Yeah, but not just community organisers. I wouldn't say they're necessarily, I mean, community organisers, yes, but not just community organisers. Or maybe it depends what you mean by community. Trans activists campaigning for trans activists aren't a community in the sense of they live in a locality together necessarily, but if that's what you mean by community, then yeah, people representing themselves and saying this is what we need, we demand. The question at the back is one that not the question puzzles me, the answer puzzles me.
Is this the question, who profits from
Who
Brexit?
profits from
Yeah.
Brexit? Yeah, because the British capitalists aren't really keen on Brexit. The majority of MPs aren't really keen on Brexit. So the ruling class is not really keen on Brexit. It is a minority. You've always had a minority on the right of Eurosceptics, skeptical of the European Union. Many of those are also people who dream of empire and that we can have our day again. And there are some of those who I think are just fantasists talking about we can, if we break completely from the EU, then we're free to trade with everywhere in the world. We've got all these friends around the world because of the Commonwealth. I think that's just fantasist, but those I can understand in terms of they're definitely people who are keen on Brexit. But others I don't really understand. I suppose what a lot of them seem to be doing is going, well, if we're going to maintain stability within the UK, we need to in some way recognise the Leave vote. So what's the minimum we have to do possible to do that, to maintain social peace, right, in some way have some concession towards the Leave vote while trying to be as least disruptive as possible. But I don't know. I'm trying not to think like the ruling class. I'm trying to think differently. But in terms of trying to understand the rationale, that seems to me something that's plausible. But I don't know. Is the genuine, honest answer? I don't know.
Okay, let's take a few more questions and comments. That's Andrew in the back.
Should I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was kind of fixated on your discussion, focus on contradiction, and I'd like to add a couple of contradictions. First, you talked about the Johnson-Forrest tendency. There was a very serious contradiction within that, between Johnson and Forrest. You know, C.L.R. James Johnson thought that spontaneity was enough. Working class needs no theory, according to him. Raevnivskaya went in the exact opposite direction. You know, and she said the crisis essentially is a crisis of the lack of a philosophy of revolution. Working people are looking for theory, and they need to be met halfway. Just to say, you know, they need to organize and change things, that's not meeting them halfway with a philosophy of liberation so that they can keep their eyes on the prize and not be, you know, waylaid. Okay, there's a very deep contradiction. The deepest contradictions are always internal. And when the Irish were fighting for national liberation 150 years ago, Marx said that the problem with the way a lot of the English working class was responding, which was negatively, was a people that oppresses another people. The English oppressing the Irish A people that oppresses another people forges its own chains. And that's a really deep contradiction. You're acting to forge your own chains, your own chains of unfreedom. And we're seeing this today with, some working class people who went with Trump. We're seeing that with the people who went for Brexit, because they think they're going to maintain their privileges as English people, and they're emboldening Farage and people to the right of him, and that means, in concert with Bannon and Trump and all of those forces. So it seems to me, maybe you don't have the answer, but you can't put it all in the backs of the working people and say, they got to self-mobilize. What, 6 million people signed the petition, or whatever you said. People came out for a second referendum, and all the little groups you're talking about. In the U.S., the resistance mushroomed from out of nowhere overnight. Okay? That's not the crisis we face. The crisis we face is the lack of people to say, here is a direction forward that will mean your own liberation. Here's a way of proceeding that will mean your own liberation. We're not trying to tell you to line up behind us, but take these ideas seriously to guide your own movement forward until you've achieved that full freedom. So I think we've got to bring something to this instead of saying, well, they got to work it out.
Yes, I forgot your name, I'm sorry.
Mitchell.
Mitchell.
So, thank you very much for your talk. It was actually very fascinating to play through all these contradictions, many of which I haven't thought about in the current, what's happening currently. And so this was a really good example. I wanted to actually just repeat, or not repeat, but bounce off of what Andrew was saying, which I agree with. But just in a more simple way, so you've spent a lot of time talking about the one half of the contradiction of the self-actualization of the working class, and that the so-called left leadership, as it currently exists, is thinking and acting in a way that mimics the state and treating themselves as the state. But there's more of an interplay, I think, between the leadership at any given time anyway, and the actualization of the working class. It's not as if those two are totally separated from each other. So I thought you would comment more on what is that interplay, and how does actually, somebody started the petition, right? Somebody wrote the petition. Well, that was leadership of some sort. So how does that interplay happen, and how do you see it going forward?
I'll call on myself. Yeah, it's not leadership per se that's evil, unless you're an anarchist, I guess. We're Marxist-Humanists. We don't think that. It's leadership that tries to substitute itself for the mass movements, for the workers' movements, and says we have a 10-point program or whatever it is, and you got to follow us step by step, and the masses are too stupid and backward to work it out for themselves. So that's very different from a kind of philosophic leadership which says we can all learn a hell of a lot from Karl Marx. Adam spoke on, what Marx did, right? What Marx said about the Irish rebelling against the UK, against England back then, and that was the only way out of their subservient situation, both for the Irish but for the English workers too. The English workers couldn't be free while they were helping to suppress the Irish. And you should read our perspectives report, because there's a section that goes into this at length. And Andrew Kleiman again has written a lot about this, analyzed this actual points at which Marx spoke about the American Civil War and the Irish movement, and drew parallels. But I want to just pick up on this question of philosophic leadership. Putting out ideas is what I mean. Ideas that people can grab onto and can help them envision a different world and can help them realize that capitalism is not an eternal given. I think we've sort of lost sight of that because so much of the left is just talking about managing capitalism. We need to redistribute the money to the 99%. Not talking about, well, what's the nature of the society? Why does everyone hate their job if they even have a job? Why, you know, why is all this stuff going on that's not the best thing that human beings could work out for organizing how to live? So I think that's an area we want to explore, and I'm sure Adam would have gotten to the positive, after trashing the rest of the left, would have gotten to what's positive in Marxist-Humanism, and I hope you'll look into it. But I want to just also raise the issue of racism and ethnocentrism and white nationalism, which you seem to have plenty of over there as well as here. I mean, this has really become the Achilles heel of every society lately. You know, we thought we'd evolved beyond that, but it keeps coming back and it keeps coming back. And until we uproot those horrible ideas that some people are inferior, we're going to always be fighting. I mean, it's amazing to me, you know, when Chris just says casually, well, of course the IRA, who never accepted the Irish peace, are going to come and blow up anything they can. I mean, why is this still going on now? And why is the U.S. Becoming more and more racist with more hate crimes and more horrible things? There's something there that has not been taken care of. You know, the American Civil War only ended chattel slavery. It didn't end the whole rest of what's rotten in the society. And I think the Irish peace didn't resolve the problems in Ireland. It wasn't thoroughgoing kind of revolutionary change that's needed. So we're not just talking about, do we need leadership, do we need mass movements just to get over this particular obstacle in front of us, whether it's Trump or Brexit. We're really, I hope, thinking more long-term about how will we ultimately transform the society with a thoroughgoing social, economic revolution, that we could really begin to have working people and minorities, etc., really take control of their lives and reorganize production and human relations and everything. So that's my plug for look into Marxist-Humanist Initiative, because it's these kind of theoretical questions we're working on. Okay, who else would like the floor? Because I spoke so long. Just a minute, because I want to see if anyone who has not spoken wants to speak. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, you touched a lot of bases, but you say leadership, say anarchy, you say money, and we have that, you know, the jobs picked up, but I think we need a good president. Since Nixon, we haven't had a good president. There was a war, and he died. Still, you know, votes, but Watergate touched everybody, too. I think that's what brought us to ahead up to today, you know. But I'm pleased to be in this street company right now, realizing what's going on. But anyway, I think if Hillary would have become president, right, it would change the outlook on life for everybody, society. A woman behind a desk, you know. They say leadership, they say this thing. But since what good president did we have? And you know, the money there was like a depression. That was its way to start all over again. But I think we're back on it like that. But you know, I think it has to happen with this. I think the world's overpopulated. You know. The theory is, my theory is, it started one way or the other. You know, I can't call it. I'm on a mission. I do the addition, but I think God has to take the world back. You know, maybe some people feel offended by being guarded to the picture, and I'm not guarded, I don't think I'm guarded. But he has to take it back at 100%, and then just, sit back and look instead of enjoying himself, because it is terrible what's going on, And then they're trying to pinpoint the Irish, And my mother's part Irish too, and the Irish, you look at the Irish, you say PBA, you say Anoutly, you say Westie, you say Shanny, like that, but I don't know why they try to pinpoint, like on an island, why it went back that way. Because they don't the liquor, you bring it to Mexico, Coronas, And I just, I don't
All right. We get your point. We won't blame it on the liquors. Okay?
All right.
Let me see if somebody else wants to say something.
I guess an ongoing challenge is actually being able to disseminate a message to a wide enough audience that you can actually create that sort of movement. And I think an ongoing challenge, even within the media landscape in the United States, is the fact that so much of the information that's actually disseminated is controlled by so few people. So how are you supposed to actually create movements when you can't even get the message out there to begin with?
Just along that point, I had a similar question, or at least a related question. I kind of tried to touch very briefly in my talk about. I didn't really put it in these terms, but I think you can kind of extrapolate from there. I have an issue with the way politics is discussed in America. I think a lot of the categories in the framework that we talk about, where it's, there has to be some sort of confusion if you can say that a neoliberal centrist and a neo-fascist are equally bad. So just kind of along that point, I'm curious, maybe if you could comment a bit about the way that information about Brexit, or the way that Brexit is being discussed in the UK, is occurring. Is that also part of the quagmire? Is that people can't really are having trouble thinking about it in a different way than just these stay, leave, no deal options and so on?
Someone else? You want to say anything? I see you nodding. I don't know what you think.
No, I guess I'm still just trying to wrap my head around it, and going back to basics is why now? Why is all of this coming up now? I mean, all these ideas that someone's not the same as me has been there forever. So why is Brexit come up 2 years ago-ish? I'm trying to understand what led to the start. What were the driving forces for it? What pushed it?
Do you want to answer if you can, or maybe you can't? I mean,
Do
maybe
you want to answer all the difficult questions?
I'll answer it.
I do want to say something. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, because this is challenging questions like this are ones that will make me think, and that's one of the things that we need to do, rather than patting each other on the back. Ask genuine questions that we want answers to, and the questions, a lot of questions people have asked me are questions I want answers to as well. And if we can work together in trying to work through the answers to those questions, then I think that's a good place to start. There is this curious thing that a few people have kind of alluded to in various ways in relation to leadership and mobilization of people becoming engaged. And it's not leadership of the left, it's just leadership in general. It struck me that where the big kind of engagement of people in something political in the UK over the last few years have been things that have been started by ruling elites. In Scotland, the independence referendum wasn't a grassroots movement demanding an independence referendum. It was a party that distinguished themselves from other parties for electoral terms by saying, we are the Scottish National Party. They initiated the referendum. And something curious happened, which is that initially people just weren't really interested. And then people just start talking a little bit. And then it just starts to pick up momentum. And one of the things that was really interesting about the discussion in Scotland that you didn't have in, as far as I could tell, in Brexit, was well, okay, if we were going to have independence, what kind of society would we want? And there was that really interesting question that's been asked. What way would we want it? I think it's maybe an indication of the low horizons that people have and still thinking in terms of state, that what most people thought is, look at the Scandinavian countries, they have great welfare and they look after their elderly and all, and that might be the model. But asking the question, I think that's the right question to ask. That's something that can take you places if you're willing to think that through and pursue that question. What kind of society we want, and then how do we make that happen? How do we organise that? But it's curious that it's political elites that kind of create the circumstances in which that happens. Likewise, Brexit there was no demand for Brexit. There was no popular demand for Brexit. It was within the Conservative Party, the Eurosceptic wing that have been there forever, said we want to have it, and it's at one level it's just a set of accidental circumstances, yeah. So it's the fact that they're saying we want to have a referendum. There's concern within the Conservative Party of, well, we have the growth of UKIP to the right of us. There's concern that the membership of the Conservative Party, which has shrunk really dramatically, it used to be the biggest mass membership party in the United Kingdom. It shrunk really dramatically and got very elderly, and a lot of its members are what David Cameron described as swivel-eyed loons. They just have nutty ideas about what's wrong with the world and what needs to be done about it. And I think what Cameron genuinely thought is, okay, they're saying they want to have a referendum, they're going to keep on saying it, let's just get them to shut up by having a referendum, because no one's going to vote to leave, or they're not going to get a majority for it, and then they'll just shut up and sit in the corner. But something happened that meant that process is out of control. One of the things that's going on definitely is what in the UK is referred to as voter de-alignment or voter volatility. Political loyalties to political parties have eroded. So those areas of the UK that are deindustrialised, where significant sections of working class voted to leave, those are areas that were core Labour voting places, and felt under Tony Blair, they're just ignored. They're just taken for granted. They're going to vote. If Labour puts up a monkey to stand in the election, they'll get voted. Right. And they felt like they were just being taken for granted. So they started to vote for UKIP. So the hollowing out of those institutions that used to be the representatives of the working class has meant working class people looking elsewhere. Where else is there? So there is a sense in which working class people are looking for leadership. There is that going on, and there is this issue of, well, so there is a challenge there, I suppose, for us. I think the way you put it, Andrew, is really useful. There is a responsibility for people who are saying, look, this is awful and we're trying to think it through, to try and think it through and provide some answers. I'm really reluctant, I really want to do that, but I'm really reluctant to say it's easy, because it's not. I'm really reluctant, I really think there's a tendency on many parts of the left to go for the first answer that seems to make sense and go, right, we've got it now. No, it is hard work and it needs to be thought through. So I think that's an important thing. There's a real temptation, because people always ask me what's the answer, when you're talking about Brexit, what's the answer people want. There's a real temptation to try and say, well, okay, let's try and do some prediction. I've been really resistant to doing that, but I think the points that people are bringing out about leadership show the limits of what I've done in terms of doing that. So that's a real challenge for me, something to think about. I do think I wouldn't underestimate what I've done so far in terms of it's to get there, you do need to say, well, what is the nature of the problem, and try and clarify that. And just to answer you, in the UK, very few people are doing that. The people who are political are going remain and shouting at people who are leave, and the people who are leave are going leave and shouting at the people who are remain, and that just generates heat and no light at all.
Just by that, are you referring to speaking about this in terms that aren't just binary stay leave, or speaking about in purely electoral terms?
I mean people who are actually engaged in politics. Yeah, they're the people who are not engaged in binary terms, people who are interested in politics, are just going, just leave Brexit. It's over there, like somebody else's problem. Yeah, so there's no one that's doing that attempt to go, right, how do we think our way through this?
Okay.
That's the real challenge. That's the really difficult thing, because you can't ignore it. It's the big issue. You can't ignore it, but at the same time, it is all of these things I said about. It's irresolvable. It's a paradox. There's loads of contradictions. So, but I think the first step is to recognize all of those things, and to recognize, right, there aren't shortcuts here. There's hard work that needs to be done. And it's only when we start to do that that we're going to start to get somewhere, and that we can get possible answers. But I don't have any of those yet. But it's good if other people are wanting to do that hard work, because I think that's one of the things that meetings like this can do. I think the MHI website is a forum in which those discussions can start to take place. You know, that's one of the things I found great about MHI as an outlet for someone who's trying to go beyond the leave, remain binary and publish things that are questionless.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple of more comments. Let me just, on that note, of read our website. Make sure you sign our mailing list too. We don't have a lot of public meetings, but we'll certainly let you know. And we send out a MailChimp letter occasionally telling you what's new and what's going on. Who's got that mailing list? Mike, have you got it? Or, oh, there it is. Okay. Could you pass it around again? Whoever, well, let him pass it back to the woman. Yeah. And anyone else, and the people who are milling around, if you want a copy of our statement who Marxist-Humanist Initiative is, you can come and get that. And don't forget to get Chris's book, and you can get our book. Okay, last round of comments or questions. Mike, you had your hand up, no?
Yeah, I don't know, I guess maybe it's not a possibility, you think, but what are the odds that you give for the people's, another vote, or what they call the people's vote? And is it possible to have a better, you know, have that be a catalyst for those kinds of linkages that you were talking about? That would be great, like migrants and Irish Republican movement, or other linkages. That would be emancipatory in the crucible of like a new referendum.
Well, the short answer is a second referendum isn't going to resolve a whole lot of the contradictions that I pointed out. But is it a way forward? I don't know. In part, I think it depends on the form in which it comes up. And I can't see it being formulated in a way that's going to encourage people who are interested in human emancipation. But certainly, whatever comes up, there's still opportunities for whoever is thinking about this critically to go, look, here's all sorts of problems with the way things are being presented. Here are some of the forces in society that are saying something different that's positive, that suggests some ways forward.
There's even an issue of who can vote. It's already a radical issue, right? Because the demand but by the people who want a second referendum, is that all the EU migrants living in the UK should be allowed to vote. They're the ones most affected, and there's 3 million of them, and that's a lot. But of course, under normal, law, they're not citizens; they can't vote. So
Well, no, that's not strictly true. There's EU citizens have a right to vote in EU elections. They have a right to vote in local government elections. They have a right to vote in the devolved assemblies, so Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. They don't have a right to vote in Westminster. So in the setting up of the referendum, there was parliamentary manoeuvres to make sure that it was the Westminster election system that was going to be the basis on which the referendum would take place.
Oh my God. States' rights.
That seems a bit suicidal if the whole point is to get the Brexit people to shut up by having a referendum.
Yeah, but I think the calculation was it just wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to have enough people.
Yeah, so they made, the same mistake that a lot of people made here about, we couldn't win, and Trump couldn't win, and they underestimated, I think, the depth of and persistence of racism and xenophobia that came to the fore in both situations. It has to be uprooted.
Which actually reminds me, I only half answered your question. I'll try and answer the other half, because there's kind of chance factors, but I think those chance factors take place in a broader context where there's so many chance factors. There's definitely something else going on. It's not, you can't just sort of put it down to chance. And one of the things that's happening, I think, is the liberal democracy doesn't have many defenders of liberal democracy anymore, and that there aren't people who are willing to say, well, actually, whether you want to have a new, better society, there's still some good things about liberal democracy that are worth defending and still need to be defended. And I think that's a problem globally. Yeah. So I find myself in a peculiar situation of wanting to have a revolutionary transformation of society and at the same time feeling like I need to defend liberal democracy. But recognizing that's limited, that's only going to get us so far, but the alternative, no liberal democracy, is worse.
I'll be speaking about that tomorrow, too.
Right.
Oh, good. Come to our panel tomorrow, everybody. Okay, anyone else want a last word? No? Okay, where's that mailing list? Make sure, okay, very good. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Bluestockings, and thank you, audience. Please stay in touch with us. All right.